You're listening to Unlimited Hyperbole. I'm Joe Martin. Every industry and medium on the planet has its high points. It doesn't matter whether it's comics, books, films or music. Every year sees new media rising to the top to reap a fresh harvest of accolades, and the games industry is no exception. Yet at the same time, it can't honestly be said that many of these titles are advancing their fields in profound ways. Your average Grammy-winning pop song may well have a catchy tune, but it's only rarely that an artist will emerge to push boundaries in ways that few others would conceive. And the games industry is no exception here either. So when a game comes along which really does do things differently, you can be sure it will leave a lasting impression on those who experience it.
When Thief came out, it was this completely different, weird, experimental thing.
That's the voice of Brendan Chung, who's best known as the founder of Blendo Games and the developer behind Atom Zombie Smasher and Gravity Bone. Though it was more than a decade before either of these that Brendan says his eyes were first opened by Looking Glass Studios as Thief, the Dark Project.
It made a really big impact on me and on how I kind of viewed games and how I played games. It encouraged me to make things that not necessarily what people want. Because I think at that time period, if you were to ask people what they wanted, they would have said, oh, we want a first-person shooter with more guns and more monsters and nicer looking graphics. But what I feel Thief did was that it didn't really give people what they wanted, but it gave people what they didn't know that they wanted. It gave people what they needed. This completely new experience, this thing that we hadn't really seen before. So when I try to make things, I try to not necessarily make a bigger, better version of what has already been done 1,000 times before, but to try to experiment with new things, to try to give people something that they haven't seen a million times already.
And that's exactly what Thief did in 1998 when it introduced players to the master criminal Garrett and the medieval fantasy world he lived in. Thief broke down technological barriers as the first game to use light and sound as mechanics for effecting stealth. But more than that, it was characterized by the darkly ambivalent tone it took, and the way it pushed players to experience it.
It was the fact that you played this very underpowered character, and the fact that enemies were extremely dangerous. They weren't just, cannon fodder that you pump 3 bullets into and they drop dead. These were characters that had big swords, and you were a terrible sword fighter, so you had to not take the frontal approach, but you had to kind of exploit the AI, you had to work your way around them and how to outsmart them. And the other big thing was that they gave you a lot of agency to do different things in the world. I mean, you didn't just have like a pistol or a shotgun. They gave you different types of arrows to douse out the lights, to distract the guards, to shoot rope arrows, to climb up to different vantage points. All these different tools that are available to you. And they let you into this kind of simulated world and just gave you free reign.
This level of agency is one of the things which makes Thief such an empowering and memorable game, even by today's standards. And it perhaps wouldn't be unfair to say that Thief is really more of a puzzle game than a stealth title as a result. Each level can have a dozen different solutions, and there's often little to say that any specific route is better than the others. Sometimes you might choose to incapacitate every opponent between you and the treasure, while others you might stay your hand. The only judgment that's placed on you comes in the dryly cynical comments Garrett makes as he proceeds, and that allows players to come up with their own rules.
I mean, just the character Garrett itself is so wonderful. You're not this knight in shining armor. You're not, you're kind of this morally gray guy who does kind of terrible things. That's so much more interesting to me. I actually used to visit the Through the Looking Glass, their forums, and they have a bunch of different, I guess you could say, house rules for different types of play styles. So I think one of my favorite play styles is to try to play through it without leaving any evidence that I was ever in the building.
That's called the ghost playthrough, by the way, and as well as making sure you aren't detected by enemies, it also calls for closing all doors behind you, replacing any items you've moved, relighting all torches, and removing any rope or moss arrows you might have used as well.
Even though it's a single player game, my friend and I would kind of, play cooperatively. Like, he would sit in a chair next to me, and I would play, and we would switch off. And the fact that the game, like for most games, that wouldn't work very well. I mean, for a very straightforward game where you're just, shooting things, there's not a lot of decisions to be made, not a lot of experimentation. But what's cool about that with Thief is that it kind of accommodates for that, of having people around you like shouting suggestions. Oh, try doing this thing. Try distracting him by throwing a potted plant behind him. And I love that. The fact that it gives you this agency makes the world so much more fun to play and makes so much more interesting decisions for you to choose. Like an example is like when a guard sees you, it doesn't just dump you back to a checkpoint, or it doesn't instantly kill you. You get to continue playing the mission, but then you have to just adapt to this whole new situation where the guards are on high alert, things are much more dangerous, but the game continues. It treats it like a simulation. And I think games kind of shy away from that because it makes the game extremely difficult, and it's kind of it's a very bold choice to go for design, I think.
At the same time as providing a lot of tools and agency to solve problems, however, Thief also avoided the pitfall that many modern games fall into by keeping the scope of its puzzles tightly constrained. Levels were always focused around specific jobs and secluded areas, and, unlike the third game in the series, the first Thief had no open world element in between missions. While much of this was undoubtedly due to the limited technology of the time, it's likely the financial pressures facing the developer affected the game too. In 1997, Looking Glass Studios was starting to face serious difficulties, with redundancies directly impacting Thief's team. Large features including multiplayer support were cut as development continued, though what the game lost in scope, it regained in focus.
When I develop my stuff, I'm very picky about the scope of my projects, because I'm only one person, so for me to tackle something that's bigger than me is, it would mean I would just never ship anything. So one thing I really, really love about Thief is that I think if you're to give many developers, the same pitch for the project, you're the thief, you have to steal something from this safe, and the gameplay kind of revolves around that. I think a lot of developers would be tempted to go full bore on this do anything you want approach gameplay, and they would make something with an extremely large scope and have 1 billion features in there. And what I like about Thief is that there are a lot of moving parts, but they keep it fairly constrained, actually. They don't let you do anything. Like, the sword fighting is extremely simplistic, and I think a lot of developers would be tempted to we got to have some counter parry system and execution moves and blah blah blah. But I like that they kept the scope very controlled, and I've spoken about this before, but I think that limitations are extremely good for game design. It forces you to be much more creative as opposed to having unlimited resources and dumping everything into a game.
That Thief focused so definitely on what it could do well allowed it to plough much more depth into its individual components than most larger scale titles could ever manage. Cutscenes, for example, fused full motion video with hand-drawn art to create a moody and immediately recognisable aesthetic, while the fiction was filled with dozens of poems and subplots. More than anything though, it's the sparse dialogue and stunning sound design which first come to mind when most fans remember Thief, and listening to this excerpt from the start of the game, it's easy to see why.
I was a kid. No parents, no home. Running messages and picking pockets to keep my ribs from meeting my spine. One night I saw a man. Folks just passed him by like he wasn't there. I thought he must have something valuable, so I snuck up on him and made a grab.
That's not for you.
Please, sir, I'm hungry. Don't tell the Hammers, I promise.
What is your name, boy?
Garrett.
You have talent, lad.
Let go of me, old man!
To see a keeper is not an easy thing, especially one who does not wish to be seen. We have a need for those as gifted as yourself. If you've grown tired of how you live, then follow me, and we will show you a different way.
Leave me alone!
As you wish.
I caught up with him just before he vanished into the crowd. It was the beginning of a very long education.
The audio work is spectacular. The sound work was done so amazingly well. There's no real traditional music score. I don't think they really trigger music cues to happen at specific times. The approach they took was that just the world ambiance had this kind of pulsing, rhythmic, and kind of weirdly techno flavor to it, which gives the world this really unique identity. I feel that having an identity for your game is very important. When I look at a screenshot, I think a lot of games have a problem with is that you look at a static screenshot and it just looks like this generic thing that you can mistake for 10,000 other games. And I feel that with Thief is that they've created this very unique and different universe from other games. What the studios did was that they made this universe that you can't really mistake for other universes. You have these bits of steampunk, you have this medieval stuff, you have actual electricity in the world, you have magic used by the wizards and stuff. It's this really amazing mishmash of different elements, and it created this identity that made Thief unmistakable from other games. So for me, that definitely was a huge impact. If you have this opportunity to make something and put your name on it, I feel that it should be something that kind of reflects something that's very unique to you, something that hasn't already been done 1,000 times. Because why bother just repeating something that's already been done?
Unlimited Hyperbole is produced by Harriet Jones and me, Joe Martin, with music this week by Dexter Britton. You can follow the show online at joemartinwords.com/podcast, and you can also follow Harriet and I on Twitter at @HC_Jones and @Joe3pwood, respectively. If you like the show, then be sure to listen in to future episodes, to subscribe on iTunes, or even just tell your friends about it. We embed each episode freely on the website so you can share them easily, and next week we'll be talking to someone else from the games industry about the title which helped define them.